This is a new meeting within the framework of the seminars that we are organizing along the World Bank about these problems of the effects of the pandemic and the challenges they brought to the educational system. Now, today, we will discuss remedial strategies. We will be listening about a report which was published and shared today, and we will be sharing the website where you can download it, and we have a great panel that we will introduce to you. You may introduce yourselves and greet, but we kindly ask you to ask your questions using the Q&A button, and we will do all in our hands to respond to them. So I would like to invite Emanuela to offer a few introductory words. Thank you, Ariel. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure being here within this context of this webinar on remedial programs for the recovery of learning in Latin America. And as he said, this is a part of a series of events the World Bank and the Dialogue are organizing within the framework of going back to school. I will be quite brief, I think. Well, I don't know who of you had the opportunity of participating in last week's webinar, but mainly we are facing in Latin America an unprecedented crisis in the educational sector, and all the simulation and data that we have indicate that we are losing learning, and that's massive, that's really huge, and that's affecting the most vulnerable people. But not only that, and last week we discussed about an activity and a key intervention in order to start this recovery, and that's the evaluation of learning. And this week we will be talking about remedial programs in order to recover learning based on the results of this evaluation. And once we have the results, we need to design and implement initiatives and programs that actually allow us to recover this. We can call them remedial programs, or we can call them some other way. But something important about these programs is that there are many questions about how to design them, how to implement them, which ones can be more effective, and in which context. So there are many questions that we need to answer in Latin America. So we expect that as part of this context and the report being presented today, plus the discussion following this report presentation, we hope this is useful to clarify these doubts and to share the best practices that are being applied in Latin America and other places in order to tackle this issue. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ariel so that he can share more detail about how this is organized. But once again, I would like to thank everyone for the organization of this event and your participation. And we expect to generate ideas and responses and best practices in this event and how to move forward with our programs. Thank you, Emanuela. And as she mentioned, we just published a report that analyzes the experience with remedial programs, those that classify and provide some important messages about lessons learned. So now we will give the floor to María Esther Mancebo, a researcher and professor of Universidad de la República in Uruguay. She's one of the co-authors of this report, and she will be doing that presentation. Afterwards, we will give the floor to Mrs. Failan, the other author, and she will be moderating the panel and introduce the panel. So, Esther, we would like to invite you to do your presentation. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being with you, introducing or presenting this report. And I would like to share my screen so that we can see the characteristics of this study, what we were able to discover in this program of recovery of learning, and the tasks that are really important and what's ahead of us, those who make decisions at micro and macro level, and all the educational systems in Latin America in order to foster these recovery lines for learning that we know are really important in pandemic times. So,
¿Estamos viendo?
can you see my screen?
¿Se está viendo bien?
Sí, se está viendo
Are you
bien.
able to see my screen? Yes.
El documento.
So this document that you will have access to, it's called Recovery Programs, Learning Recovery Programs, Evaluation of Evidence and the Potential for Latin America. Out of this title, which was decided actually, I would like to mention two aspects. First is that after reviewing the bibliography and all the material we had, it's quite an extensive material which collects lots of experiences that in the world and Latin America have been developed in this field from the educational policies. With Elite Bayat, we reached the conclusion that the most suitable term that we should use and that we could use in order to make reference to these sort of programs, it's the term of learning recovery programs. And in the literature, specialized literature, this term appears a lot, but there are some others. It's frequent to find acceleration programs or leveling programs are remedial programs, and this is done in an ambiguous manner. So for different reasons, and since we identified six different modes of programs for learning recovery, and that's why we consider this is the term that fits best this variety of experiences. And depending on beyond the title, I would like to highlight the importance of the word evidence, because this is a report limitations that are part of our study was based on evidence. So we could have taken 12 programs as or hundreds of other programs in which there are descriptions all over the world, but we focus on those programs with rigorous evidence, with the scope which is clearly delimited, and we also try to rescue the potential of programs and how what aspects could be particularly useful in this Latin American context. And I don't know, I'm having trouble here. The content of this study will cover 5 points. The first one, it's some brief lines that complement what I already said about the study. The distinction of 6 kinds of programs, a cross-cutting view of programs trying to focus on the key dimensions. And from that, we built with Denise a matrix that states the requirements of programs for learning recovery, understanding that these requirements, some of them are not common to the 6 kinds of programs, but many of them are specific for each kind of program. And finally, we stated a path, a clear path for those who make decisions. For instance, ministers and different stakeholders from the civil society, professors and directors who are working in the field. So this was stated for decision making, and we expect this is useful. This roadmap is useful for this task. So what do we mean when we talk about learning recovery programs? This is quite simple, actually. It's like saying that it's about educational interventions that aim at bridging the gaps between what the student knows and what is expected from the student to know. And sorry to interrupt you, but we cannot see slides are. No. We just have the title. Let's see. I try again. Now we are there, yes. Sorry, I'm sharing my screen, so it's there whenever you want me to move to next slide. Perhaps it's an issue with my Zoom, but the previous one, please, Sara. Perfect. I was saying we kept this simple definition in which we consider that incorporates the different modalities of learning recovery programs. Next, please. So how was this study conducted? We had as a trigger this aspect that Emmanuel and Ariel mentioned about the consequences of the pandemic crisis had specifically on our education, on the education of all of our countries. And we are seeing and we will see in the next in the following time some rates of repetition because learning is not the same, or dropouts and trajectories that will be interrupted. All this, as Emanuela mentioned, there are some simulations that offer alarming data, but as time goes by, we will have studies that one way or the other will corroborate, will confirm this awareness we have at the moment, indicating that crisis was enormous in the educational field. And with this issue in mind, the study chose as a methodology reviewing systematically the literature that it's already present about previous programs, and in most cases these were previous to the pandemic, and many of these programs kept being applied during the pandemics in primary and medium education, not necessarily in the start education, not university education. And these recovery programs for learning recovery programs were found in different literatures, in Selic, Compass, among others. And as part of the enormous accumulation of publications about this issue, we selected carefully all studies that had rigorous evaluations. And when I say rigorous and and assessed positively. And it's every time there were impact studies, we considered them, and many of the results are included in the report, but we also found experiences that were quite fruitful with evaluations, having or not having evaluations. Not having evaluations was an excluding criteria to be considered as part of our sample. But what I mean is that we found rigorous studies that limited to offer results of the programs or even opinions on the programs, but that were not strictly evaluations of impact. So in this effective transformation, uh, it wasn't picture the education reality with control groups and treatment groups, ex ante and ex post and baseline. So all these requirements of impact study evaluation, we know that that's not frequent. And there are some, but that's not frequent. Another limitation, and that's important to mention from the beginning, it's the limitation uh, that has to do with the financing. And we actually traced all the information about costs, about efficiency and cost and effectiveness, because the dialogue in the conversations with the dialogue, we knew, well, also with the World Bank, we knew that the concern about how programs are financed is a key one, because if we cannot fund them, we cannot execute them. So the main or the problem that we identified accurately, it's the lack of studies that actually mention the costs, cost effectiveness, and how much is spent per alumni, and all these rates and ratios that are key in order to have a suitable budget for a program and know if we can have a pilot experience and escalate it. So this has been an important limitation, but with all of the limitations, if the certainty I want mm, to share, it's that the empiric evaluation that is found in the report, it works as evidence, which is sustained by evaluation studies that are rigorous. Next slide, please. So the first view on the experiences left us in trouble, because we found a world which is heterogeneous, because learning recovery programs, some of them happen as part of the school time, some part, some are working with paid tutors, some are honorary, some tutors are the parents, some tutors are teachers with lots of experience. So we were puzzled because goals were mixed, and some say that simultaneously we want to tackle the dropout situation. We want to bring kids that are not part of the education system, and simultaneously we want to improve their learning process. And all these goals are present. So the heterogeneity, it's a characteristic that one way or the other, when we, each one of us, when we consider this study of learning recovery programs that can work as background, we were shocked, because we were wondering what to do in order to develop effective programs. Next slide, please. So, in this mosaic of programs with such heterogeneity, we consider 6 different kinds of programs that, from our perspective, should differentiate each contribution, because each one of them actually uses a tool for education policy in particular. Well, they are all learning recovery programs, but the leveling programs use the curriculum adequation as a key, as a basic element. The acceleration ones are supported on the accelerated learning model. In the tutorships, tutors are the key element in teaching at the right level. There is an allocation of students according to their competence level, and from there they teach in small groups. The extension of pedagogic time, it's specialized, but it is conducted in an universal, not focalized manner, and this considers the increase of the pedagogic time, and learning by computer. It's supported on the existence of hardware and software which are specialized for the development of better learning and better teaching. So, according to what I just said, each of these types of programs can use different tools, and programs of tutorships can also use economic compensations or a component for uh, of food. There is a program in Uruguay, which is the program of maximization of mid-education called PU, and this has had tutorships, and this has had a component of food for those who assisted to these tutorships. And there it's a combination of different tools, but each kind includes the performance of the tool and the instrument of this element being used. So this tutorship of mentoring programs based on that. And with this criteria, we've identified 6 international experiences that were considered. For instance, the reading couple, vacancies, apprenants in France, or catch-up programs, second chance, TARL, Indian Mines Park. Next slide, please. And in Latin America, these were the experiences that we consider TARL in Mexico, Aula Global in Colombia, early learners in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, program JEE, Acceler in Brazil, and Plataformas Adaptativas in Uruguay. So we based in 2 experiences that were studied in depth, and you will find the characterization, a brief characterization and hard evidence is of evaluation studies. Sorry. So in each one of them, we had this comparison with these 12 cases. We developed a comparison that also presented difficulties. In the report, you may find a chart, a table with this information that I didn't find suitable to include in this presentation, but this is an example of the complexity of these comparisons. So here we are coming to leveling programs catch up from Turkey and early learning programs from the Caribbean or OECO, which has different programs. In one case, we have the Ministry of Education of Turkey. In the other case, we have USAID and OECO. But the target population in a case are children and young people from 10 to 14, and in the other case, it's kids from 8 to 9 years old. And the evidence. In one case, it's information from qualitative sources mainly, which offer positive results. And in the other case, the early learners programs, we have an impact study. So we had to face, and if we run a similar study tomorrow, we will keep having these difficulties because the creativity of researchers may always surpass the issues that may happen. But this is a point to consider. And by knowing about this complexity, we were able to identify three key dimensions. Sarah, please, next slide. These key dimensions for the cross-cutting analysis were the institutionality into factors that we considered in each case, the pedagogic model which was developed, and the human resources. Next slide, please. So what did we learn about institutionality and stakeholders? First, we learned that the role of the state in this group of experiences and in all the other ones that we systematize, even though in the end we didn't include them in the report, but the role of the state varies greatly. It goes from a merely state role, for instance, extended working hours in the case of Dominican Republic, up to the civil society, and this may be the important role played by the NGO Prada in fostering the STAR program in India. And in other cases, we have international organizations such as UNICEF, which promotes and puts in the agenda the contribution of resources. So the role of the state or the role of the civil society needs to be included in the agenda, design, implementation, evaluation, because there is a variety of stakeholders and there is a combination of them. And it is not about a program with a state modality which might be considered better than the private model. It's not about that. The thing is here is that these stakeholders are varied and institutionality as well. And we could, even though we require financing studies and scalability in order to corroborate this hypothesis, so that in order to escalate programs and to make them as broad as Latin America requires, probably the role of the state, sometimes with the help of international organizations in our poor Latin American countries, it's really important. And educational stakeholders are varied as well, and even more than regular programs for education, because it's the school teachers, but we have also mentors, physical education professors, social indicators, community leaders, and the family, and NGOs as well. And something important when we talk about post-pandemic times, and it's that different studies on what happened on education in times of pandemic, remote education, emergency remote education. So what happens? It's that families have been really worn out in their different tasks during the pandemic, but due to the load that implies accompanying their children and adolescents in the development and incorporation of learnings in tasks that used to be conducted at school, and for long periods started happening within their families. Next slide. So as part of the pedagogic model, we have these aspects, the importance of personalized work or customized work at a point in which we could say that here we have a huge challenge by educational systems in general terms. And why? Because this personalized work, here we have all the experiences of learning recovery as a key. And this leads us to think how can we do and how do educational systems, how can they reinvent themselves, including this personalized work and that the massification has made us lose. And this goes hand in hand with greater participation, with looking for significant learning. The mentors figure, it's repeated in different programs, not only in the mentor programs or tutorship programs, but these are accompanied by the elaboration and distribution of curriculum material, but also in the different supports from paper, radio, TV, digital media. And in all cases, we had adaptation programs. All these adaptation programs of the curriculum may be addressed or directed by the authorities, and in some kinds of programs, for instance, in leveling programs, we, Denise and myself, as authors of this study, we say that this is a key requirement, but we must understand that what we found is that by the curriculum adaptation prepared by authorities, or even by the curriculum adaptation done by the teachers in charge of an acceleration programs or mentorship, the curriculum adaptation happens. Next slide, please. Now, with regard to human resources training, what we were reviewing different experiences, we consider the historical problem of deficits of teachers in many of our Latin American systems, and that the learning recovery programs require more teachers, and also the confirmation that these learning recovery programs required training in three aspects: in evaluation of learning, because some of them, if not all, required and look on the learning of each of the students that are part of a program of any of the six kinds of learning recovery programs that we have. So this diagnosis consists on an evaluation of learning that actually offers the tutor and the school teacher, the extended time teacher, an understanding, a clear understanding on the levels that they need to move forward to. And this pedagogic strategies, if this is an acceleration program, we need to train teachers in the different accelerated learning modes. If it is a program assisted by computer, we cannot train we need to train teachers on the work with the digital platforms. And then another subject that some authors mention is the work with teachers with regard to the awareness that many teachers have, but the empathy with students in order to understand how hard it is to be left behind. There is a report in Latin America called Being Behind, or quedándonos atrás. So it meant that many were left behind, and a teacher, before all, must wear the shoes of that student who feels that it's behind his peers, that it's suffering or not learning at the same pace. A student that suffers not learning what he or she should have in these past 2 years of pandemic. So this is an element which is some sort of witness in the sense that this is some sort of absent, and we truly believe, Denise and myself, that this is a dimension that cannot be forgotten. Next, please. So this led us from these three key dimensions that are complementary to to the preparation of a chart of requirements for learning recovery programs. And we thought we included in a table the specific requirements of a leveling programs in these three dimensions, and what are the requirements for an acceleration, mentorship, and so on and so forth. So one way or the other, we determine if we can fill in these empty cells, we may have the requirements that should be included in the decision of creating a leveling program. Next, please. So this is not about a checklist. It's way more complex than that. It is not about doing a puzzle. It's way more complex than that because let's have as an example having a mentor's program. From the pedagogic perspective, it includes the design of strategies for pedagogic support that are customized because that mentor should have the tools for that personalization of the educational work, of the teaching work. So the training should be focused there beyond thinking the necessary tutors. They need to be trained. Now, from the institutional perspective, we found that the 6 kinds of programs, they all require the definition of institutional arrangements that need to be clear. Who is executing this, an NGO or the state? If the state, who in the state? The educational authority, along with the Ministry of Social Development, for instance, and who are the stakeholders and what are we asking to families? What can we expect from the school teachers? What can we expect from directors? What can we expect from foundations such as Fundación Carvajal, which is really close to programs such as Aula Rural? What do we expect from foundations and NGOs? So we need to have a clear definition of goals, and that applies to all programs. Those who work in this program need to know if they are looking for strengthening the learning in mathematics and languages, or if they are reaffiliating those kids that are out of the system, because the 3 of them may be in this program, but we may have action lines that actually allows us to reach each of the goals set. And particularly, and this is an institutional requirement for some of the programs, certainly it's not from a mentorship program. Mentors should have diagnostic tools that actually indicate where they are in terms of learning, all those kids and youngsters, and the evaluation of the program must be included on the financing part. And I reiterate, for our discomfort, this is a black box or a gray area And however, this is still a box for which we need to conduct several studies that actually inform us about the necessary costs for each of these programs. So as an example, second example, a program for the extension of pedagogic time has some other diverse requirements with regard to a mentoring program because there we don't need a pedagogic model centered on the recovery strategies that are personalized. And we need to emphasize the design and use of the extra pedagogic time. Or, as part of this program, I may have some availability of infrastructure that I don't have in a mentorship program or that I have in a different degree because tutors or mentors require a space for working, but the availability of infrastructure is key here. Next slide, please. So, our analysis leads us to the conclusion that this matrix is fundamental, and we found common requirements to the 6 kinds and requirements that are specific for each kind. Next slide, please. And therefore, we need, at the moment of building this program of learning recovery for post-pandemic times, we need indicators, educational indicators that are not satisfactory. We need a roadmap where we have different ingredients. And here we propose a roadmap, and that roadmap has more questions than answers. But many are enlisted. So it's clear that the roadmap implies going through steps that we cannot avoid, identifying alternatives, identifying the program, designing the program, and implementing it. But those who intervene in the building of a learning recovery program in its phase of the limitation of the program, of the problem, as an example, they need to define if we need to reach all the population from primary education, because all the population from primary education lost learning, or do we need to reach the population that are more that are left behind, because we know there is more loss of learning. So in the delimitation of the program, we need to ask some other questions. For instance, so we need to focus on recovering learning in mathematics and language, or do we try to recover learning in mathematics, language, history, geography, etc.? And other questions that are listed in the report, the identification of alternatives. It's nothing less than saying we will be betting on a leveling program, or will we put our cards on a program, a computer-assisted program, because each one of them has their own requirements, and it's important to conceive on a learning recovery program with the use of platforms, digital platforms, if the country has a really deficient connectivity. So this which seems obvious, needs to be clearly defined in the identification phase of alternatives to policies. And alternatives to policies may be others, but they may include the three kinds included in the report. And then we need to design the report taking into consideration, and we suggest all these requirements in terms of institutionality, in terms of training of human resources and pedagogic model. And then we will need to implement this. And we know that implementing this, in particularly the implementation as an important part of other phases, it's never a task, a technical task. It's only a technical task. This requires a political support and work with different stakeholders in the territory, being convinced and having the energy and having the willingness from those who need to conduct or execute these programs. And these are teachers, school teachers, directors, mentors, physical education teachers or trainers. Without them, that's not possible. Last slide. So as suggestions in the midterm, this doesn't mean that we need to wait for years to implement this, but that they will be done in the midterm. So we need to review cost studies that allows us to have this financiation for these activities. Second point is scalability. We need to monitor and evaluate learning recovery programs in order to know with information, specific, accurate information, and make decisions based on evidence. And we need to strengthen the learning recovery systems, because only that way we will know where we are at the beginning of the program and where we will be in the midst of the program and where will and the formative training and feedback from students and their families, and with that we are able to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now I'll pass the floor to Denise. She will be introducing the panelists, and that way we can move forward. Thank you so much, Ariel. Thank you, Esther, as well, for the presentation, to the dialogue, and to the World Bank for this opportunity to talk about this topic, which is so important for us. Greetings from Uruguay to our colleagues joining us here, and especially to our panelists who will be sharing ideas and thoughts about this topic with us. So first of all, I would like to introduce Beatrice Avalos. She is a very, very good colleague and a dear colleague from the University of Chile. Beatrice, I'm going to ask you to please share your video. So she's currently directing the PhD on education in the University of Chile. Welcome. And I would also like to introduce Mariana Zúñiga Garcia. Mariana is from the Diagnosis Unit of the National Commission for the Continuous Improvement of Education from Mexico. So welcome, Mariana. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And I would like to introduce as well Professor Bagnell Xavier Aresende from, he's a sociology professor from Brazil. He is an associate researcher. Wagner is it's a pleasure to have you here with us. So the modality of panel used this time, first of all, I'm going to ask a question to each one of you. And then we're going to ask a general question so that you can all issue your comments. I'm going to open the floor to the participants in this seminar. They are currently enabled to ask questions that have been submitted to us. So first of all, I would like Beatrice to share with us her thoughts. She She has extensive experience, not only in Chile, but also globally and regionally. She has participated in different seminars and interventions related to the learning recovery process. Patricia, I would like to ask about the type of programs having to do with learning recovery that will have to be prioritized in the region. Thinking about the scenario of the post-pandemic, what will be the main consideration that we would need to take into account to identify such programs? Beatrice, you have 7 minutes. I'm going to have that annoying role to interrupt you. So that's why I was called to attend this meeting. So we will be attentive to your ideas and thoughts. Well, thank you so much. This is an awesome question. I mean, it requires a thorough investigation in our region on these topics. But first of all, just a few words to commend you, to congratulate you for the work you have done in the gathering of the different international experiences and the rigorosity that you have done so. Looking into those programs and what has happened after the pandemic, there is a significant difference, and it's the extent of the learning problems which cover a higher number of students compared to those that are the target of the programs that you have gone over. There is a cross-functionality in the educational system in terms of the learning loss. It favors some students who are going to specific schools where they were able to have a lot of funds for online studies. But in general terms, I would say, at least if we use the case of Chile, I think that we have 80% of our school population that have lost a lot. So the first topic that I would like to mention in terms of identifying programs and problems is that there is something that is not included in those studies because it was not targeting those targets. It's the socio-emotional aspect. At this time, the Minister of Education is really astonished given the levels of violence that are coming up in high school education. Because all of a sudden they go back to school and they try to go back to those restrictions, and any program needs to address the type of situations together with the learning aspects. I think that if we think about the type of program or the identification of the different types of programs, I do think that, for example, the extended school time, this is something that goes back to the 90s. That's when the concept was introduced. I think that the school day became a learning session. We need to extend the school day that will allow regrouping the different courses or subjects based on the learning skills or needs that we may detect. And that's where we have the diagnosis that has to be done by the authority and the different school institutions. There is a huge learning that has come up from the pandemic. This is at least something that we noticed in the studies that we conducted in Chile, but there are also some comparisons with other countries. The schools, they had to rethink and reorganize the way they teach, and they had to get involved much more. So I think that involvement has to be maintained, and it's them together with the teachers doing the diagnosis that was used at the end. They had to establish this analysis of the learning status together with the emotional status, because the way to reach students will perhaps approach more a tutoring or a restricted tutoring. Tutoring only allows you to work with a group of people, and therefore there has to be a more extensive priority. So therefore, it is not so much about selecting programs, or identifying specific programs, for example, in terms of the ones you analyze, but also pedagogical actions, those programs that as a whole allow for a better learning, forms of working and content, especially when you have larger groups for tutoring purposes. So we need to learn from the pedagogical aspect, from experiences, and the relief has to deal with the school community. States need to work with the school communities or with different intermediate authorities in order to produce this. I think I like the idea of the roadmap. I think that our teachers are really concerned about the socio-emotional aspect. This is a very important issue that covers all the different perspectives. This is something that has to be taken into account in any type of program involving learning leveling. Material conditions when going back to school. We were for such a long time remotely, and I was reading in the news the amount of establishments that were affected materially in time because they were working remotely. There are facilities that are not working. There are some spaces that do require some work just to make sure that students are not gathered all together in a single place. So this is something that has to go hand in hand with the different ways to improve the learning process. I believe that at least for the vast majority of Latin American countries, this is not something that you need to do by yourself with the lowest socioeconomic levels, because perhaps the learning loss is different, but it also applies. This is all encompassing. It applies to all the different school levels, especially kindergarten and basic school. When I talk about all the different socioeconomic levels, including low and medium socioeconomic levels. I like the experience of remote working through computers. I think that this is something awesome. I mean, teachers have learned to work with technologies. They've learned to work with the different platforms. So that learning process produces new ways of teaching, and they need to discuss these new ways of teaching with their colleagues and their peers, and they need to use these platforms that are already in place, and that schools need to facilitate to make sure that people can gain access to them. And when you do this on site with the students, allows for a more intensive appreciation of the different achievements. And to wrap up, I think that there are two important things to mention. One of them is whatever you do, you can select some programs in terms of the ones we have in place, but in general terms, what we need is to make sure that the teachers learn or share what they have learned during the pandemic among themselves, and then from there they can reflect and they can analyze their experience to determine how is it that they can improve in the different groups. I think that time is of the essence, and if there are systems working from 8 to 12, extending them should be really important. We have some systems operating from 9 to 4 p.m. or 3 p.m. Instead of having a lot of hours of systematic class or curriculum, you need to use a period of time of the school time allotted to work in the different difficult areas that you need to address with the different groups. So this is the end of my intervention. Thank you, Beatrice. You have accomplished your time allotted. You referred to a series of topics that are extremely relevant, which have to do with the social-emotional aspect and this is part of the comments that many of the colleagues have provided in the seminar. The importance of the social emotional dimension, not only based on what it represents in terms of the learning process, but also because this is one way to identify what are the most effective interventions. And I do believe that today, and this is something that you indicated, not only do we need to rethink the way we learn, but also how we teach. The different actions that have been promoted by the different teachers during times of pandemic. You indicated the importance of technology and the learning process of teachers, and how can we recover this in the post-pandemic. Another important idea in your intervention is how can we share the learning, how many teachers managed to survive the pandemic, by supporting each other. So thank you so much, Beatrice. We're going to move on to the Q&A. This is targeted to Wagner. I appreciate your ideas and your thoughts. Now, in terms of what will be the role that the diagnosis evaluation plays in the programs related to learning recovery? What's the information that we have in place for the adequate identification of the type of programs that can be implemented? We do know that you are well aware of this. You have worked in Brazil about these topics. What are your thoughts and your reflections around this? Thank you, Wagner. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you for this invitation on behalf of CAED and the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. Thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate Professor Maria Esther for her presentation, and also Professor Beatrice. In Brazil, systemic assessments, large-scale assessments, they have this diagnostic character, and for 30 years, we have been producing qualified information concerning learning by part of the students, and this is used for decision-making, both in the schools and the teaching networks for the design of public policies. The problems are shared in all of the networks in Brazil. This has been mapped even before the pandemic, and we have been successful in these efforts. The difficulties that students face with Portuguese language, concerning inferences in Portuguese language, this has been diagnosed through the Brazilian networks. The same thing refers to knowledge pertaining to geometry in the math field. These assessments, even before the pandemic, they occupied an important space in the definition of priorities for our public policies in Brazil. What did the pandemic bring in terms of new information? We had an expansion in these recovery programs and remedial programs, and assessment became even more important in this process. This expansion of the remedial programs during the pandemic, it was followed by an acknowledgement and a consolidation of the importance of assessment within schools, and not only in the teaching networks, in the macro policy. And this consolidation was followed by new activities. Now we have a process of consolidating digital assessment in the schools. We are using computers for this, using specific platforms, no longer printed tests. And something else that is interesting, and this is where I will answer your question, Denise, assessment became a more formative assessment. It didn't lose its diagnostic purpose, but it became more formative because it came closer to the teachers. The these assessments were very associated with management activities, the headmaster, the principal, the secretary of education, the minister of education. But now it came closer to the teachers during the pandemic. I'll give you an example. In São Paulo, the most developed states in Brazil, it has one of the largest educational networks in the country. Only in 2022, we applied in São Paulo 5 million tests using formative assessments, using a specific learning platform which brought together the formative assessment and also teaching practices and activities for students who were in the remote learning environment. This platform became a sort of shared practice. Other states and other networks in Brazil became interested in this initiative done in São Paulo, because in the same place, under the same learning platform, the Secretariat of Education was able to include material for the students, monitoring of activities that could be done by the teachers, and also formative assessments. And it's an example of a partnership between the different entities. We had a public university, the University of Juiz de Fora, developed this platform with the Secretariat of Education of São Paulo. So it's a set of actions that provide support to the teachers in their activities. You identify specific learning activities that took place during the pandemic, and you can propose adjusted assessments, adjusted in terms of the previous evaluations. This was a very successful procedure that São Paulo carried out. Another important point that I'd like to highlight is that in Brazil, the results of assessment have been used to map, to identify the learning problems, going into detail into the contents and specific skills that must be further developed by the students, but it didn't advance as much with regards to the type of remedial program that would be most efficient for these students. We still lack research in this area. I won't have enough time to speak about this, but I have a perspective, an opinion about this. One of the reasons for the absence of specific research on what would be the best remedial programs or the ones that work the best, this happens because of the universities, the training courses for teachers, because in Brazil, these courses still are very resistant to technical discussions based on evidence about what works and what doesn't work with regards to learning programs. But in general, and I'm now moving to close my intervention, we have some clues in Brazil that show us what characteristics we should have in these programs, which clues and which activities worked. We still lack evidence, but we would have 4 main characteristics. Training of teachers, because without teacher training, we can't have remedial programs in place. Monitoring of actions that were proposed by the remedial programs. We need to monitor that, we need to plan, and we need to follow up on the execution of whatever was proposed. What we proposed, is it being carried out? The assessment associated to the teaching activities, this is important as well, and also diversification of educational resources. The more diverse are the resources, especially during the pandemic, the use of podcasts, videos, written material, printed material. So when we have more diversity, we have better reception to these programs. So in general, these would be my considerations. Denise, I apologize for going past my allotted time, but I thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this debate. I'm at your disposal.
Estuviste perfecto, no te
That was
sobrepasaste.
great. You didn't exceed your time, not even a second. So I really like the discipline of my panelists. I really hope that all people follow the same thing. I think that you have suggested topics that are quite relevant. We know that Brazil is a continent has with more than five ministries of education. If we think about the primary education, municipalities are responsible for this. So this is a country with a huge diversity that allows conducting an analysis and it gives you an overview of the problems that we have in terms of the learning and recovery. You highlighted something really important, and I think that there's a lot of food for thought in there, which has to do with the use of the systematic assessment that has been done for such a long time at the network level and at school level. The mapping that has been done by many states. This is really important for public policy and to think the scale of the different interventions. And you also mentioned something really important, and it's the fact that there are successful examples. You do have them. But more than thinking about the successful examples, what we need to think of, and this is something you mentioned, is what are the ingredients that make this example successful, and something that is really interesting, which has to do with the professional development of teachers, the continued education of teachers regarding on learning recovery, the monitoring, the execution of the different programs. How much are we complying with the objectives and the diversification of resources? It's something that has been taught at the pandemic. It has to do with the diversification of the different resources. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us. I'm going to pass the floor to Mariana and to her opinion on something different, which is a matter of concern for us in the study that we conducted with Esther. And it has to do with the capacity that the actors, official actors, the different governments have in order to escalate efforts regarding learning recovery and the scalability. And what's the potential that we have today to collaborate with different groups of stakeholders in civil society and the academy? How can we integrate to a certain extent the efforts of the public sector and the civil society thinking of the post-pandemic? Thank you, Mariana, for your inputs. Thank you, Denise. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone from Mexico. Thank you to the World Bank and the Dialogue for the invitation to this panel. It's a pleasure to hear you and to share with you. And before I respond to that question, I would like to mention that what I'm going to present reflects some of the conversations and thoughts of our work group in the diagnostic assessment around the evaluation and the programs for learning recovery. So to respond to your question, Denise, I think that first of all, we need to map the diverse actors involved in the education system. And for that purpose, I would like to refer to this PowerPoint presentation.
Bueno, tenemos que mapear quiénes son los
We need to determine who are the actors in our national education system, with emphasis that indicated that those are at the core are children, youth, and adolescents, and the parents or caregivers who are always involved. But from the pandemic, they had more engagement and participation and knowledge in terms of what are they expecting to know at different levels of education. So in this regard, we need to determine who are supporting, teachers are supporting the students, the different school authorities from including the school management, the zone supervisors, the heads of the sector, the support, the pedagogical personnel, also teachers who are educating other teachers and the authorities and educational federal authorities. So apart from this mapping of actors, we need to think of the different environments of participation and responsibility within the national education system. From the classroom, the school, the area, the school sector, and at the national level. And we also need to think beyond the vertical approaches and the things that we're seeing from the different perspectives. We need to think about this feedback that can take place among the different levels, and to think about the educational change from the different schools. So within this context, in terms of our institution, we have established a relation among the actors, the fields of action, and the participation setting. So within those components, we have the diagnostic evaluation and the learning recovery programs. And we need to look for these interactive spaces where we can feedback each other. And it begins with the fact of finding points of interest, common goals, and also thinking that all the different proposals are not going to be implemented the way they are. There has to be a process, giving new meaning. There's an appropriation and adaptation process of these different initiatives within a progressive and granular environment. So with this mapping, I would like to explain how we have done this at the Commission from the projects that we have in place, and then how we obtained support from the different actors. In terms of the project that we're currently developing, we're currently developing a diagnostic assessment of the learning process. This strategy has three core components. The first one is to generate tools for the learning diagnostic. What we have done, we have developed diagnostic tools for the use of communities at schools to determine which is the starting points of students. This strategy was implemented at the beginning of the former school cycle from second grade until third grades in the first phase. And we assessed the different learning process in reading and math, and we're developing we're assessing ethics. Versus the external application, it was done by teachers on a voluntary basis. We had different alternatives of application, and we also worked a lot to optimize the time to determine which are the outcomes. This is support, and we provided material for the application. And then we need to establish a bridge among the results of the assessment and a more clear assessment. And then we developed a set of strategies for feedback purposes to determine what is being assessed, and to provide the guidance and to teach workshops on a virtual basis. So in addition to this, we are developing a study to compile the different experiences of the learning process of students in indigenous communities. And through this, we have established the impact of external assessments, and we also reconnected some of the suggestions for feedback purposes. This is the type of material that we have that has been made available to the different school communities. I'm not going to delve into this because of time constraints, but I would like to indicate what has been the participation or the involvement of the different stakeholders in the joint activities. How have we participated with these actors? We have supported them with teachers, school authorities, teachers who will train those trainers, people from the academy, some state education authorities, and also some federal educational authorities. We are providing education material, bilingual education. So what's the type of activities that we have carried out with them? The analysis and the discussion on fundamental learning, development of instruments of diagnostic evaluation, validation, and an analysis of potential biases. We will do a micropiloting and cognitive interviews, and also. And we have done prior support to the diagnostic assessment and virtual workshops, and we have seen participation in the development of didactic guidance, the gathering of experiences, the gathering of testimonies to be communicated in our digital magazine, and we are also planning to do further analysis. What we have learned through these different interactions, we learned. We approached the other people. Mariana, my apologies, because you're reaching 8 minutes. So please, just a few seconds to wrap up. Thank you, Denise. So first, connectivity facilitated the exchange among stakeholders. And there was a process. We were able to notice that we had common interest in terms of what we're expecting students to learn, the resources and materials for learning and teaching, and the different assessments. Something worth mentioning is to stop thinking that we need to comply things. And this is about stopping and to determine what's our perspective, our common interests, and how can we move forward. And then finally, there will be mutual feedback and trust building to determine this is what we do, and it has nothing to do with other things. So we need to feedback and we need to interact. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mariana, for your support and for your inputs. And this is something that is really interesting for those of us here, and it has to do with the diversity of actors involved and the different experiences regarding the recovery of learning, students, mothers, parents, educational authorities, the community at large, the different actors in the civil society. So I do think that the experience that you're sharing with us from Mexico is explaining the need to have a connection among the different stakeholders, the need for interaction spaces. And what's most important here, which is something that you highlighted, is the need. And in the study that we conducted with Esther, we didn't have sufficient time to delve into this, but we mentioned that it has to do with the appropriation that the different stakeholders need to do in terms of the interventions related to the learning recovery. So it is not just about communicating this to the teachers involved or the management teams. This has to involve the school community in general, and the instruments and the different experiences that you have indicated. And this can actually enlighten other colleagues. Thank you, Mariana, for your inputs. There's a general question that I have for the three panelists. So before I pass the floor to some of the questions that have been asked, that have been submitted, that we had to regroup because we have quite a few of them, and I would like to hear his connection as well. And if you could please respond in 5 minutes or less, that will be ideal, so that we can allocate some time to intervention of colleagues in this seminar. You have talked about the presentation, your presentation made by Esther, the incidence or the influence of the pandemic in the learning, mainly in the vulnerable sectors. So if we were to think about these populations that had historically been excluded in Latin America, this is not something related to the pandemic, but it goes back to many years. But thinking about the different future scenarios, what will be, if I were to ask from you, if you were able to, if you had this magic approach, what would be the conditions or the condition that will allow you to, or the requirement, what would be the first requirement in order for you to increase or include that population apart from the educational centers or who are lagged? In just a few words, what would be your thoughts about this? And there's no order. Who wants to speak first? I will ask the three of you to intervene. Who wants to speak first? Beatrice?
Beatrice, te escuchamos.
Yo no levanté la mano, pero veo que...
No, pero
I didn't raise my hand, but... So I always assume that you're raising your hand. Well, I think the duty to work with these populations, I think there are a lot of experiences in Latin America, and after doing a meeting like this, we should do some local meetings about the learning that we have in every single country in terms of working with the different populations. Now, the issue is that nowadays the levels, these levels are not only pertaining to these groups, and I will try to combine this a little bit, because when you talk with the most excluded groups, at times you may end up limiting the range of change that you can implement, and the possibility of those students moving to a different stages. And I would try to, if I were the Minister of Education, which is not going to happen, I would try to produce or to have a national discussion or conversation among the different teachers, their experiences, and what is it that they can do instead of meetings to complain. So the question is, how can I do to move on? What have I learned from others? Thank you so much, Beatrice. That was very enlightening. I mean, not doing a ghetto of a vulnerable population, but instead of, this is something that applies to all the society and all the different students. Mariana, your thoughts? Thank you, Denise. To me, this question, I would approach the communities for this question, because for a couple of decades, we have documented the learning gaps that we have experienced, but we also need to recognize, on the other hand, what are the limitations or the tools that we have used. In our approach in the different assessments, and given the limitations of the different analysis, often that we do not explore other learning processes that are more detailed or things that are relevant for the education and which may have been disregarded. So on the one hand, we need to emphasize on the indigenous communities, rural communities, because they do know to determine what is it that they know and what's relevant for their education. Because oftentimes you may have a deficit idea, and from the education areas and from the assessment areas, it is very different to determine how is it that we suggest it in terms of how they receive it. So we need to reflect on these different topics, and especially in this feedback from even downwards or upwards, because we may see a lot of gains, and we need to guarantee minimum participation conditions, talking about connectivity, access to materials, both digital and printed material. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mariana. Very interesting intervention, because we're advancing to go beyond to think. You also spoke about the indigenous community, which is something quite evident within our content, how to include them within the processes. Wagner, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you once again. Thinking about the Brazilian case, I believe we would have to have a long-term reform, a large reform. We would have to reform the main public education structures in Brazil, especially the valuation and the acknowledgement of the role of the teacher, because each and every student can learn regardless of their social education or social economic situation. We need a reform concerning the capacity building for teachers. We need better wages, and we need capacity building for these stakeholders. We must require a high level qualification for teachers so that they can deal with all of the problems that we have diagnosed. So we need to prepare our teachers to deal with the problems that we have found. We need a very comprehensive policy to acknowledge teachers. That would be crucial so that we could start a discussion about the minority groups in Brazil. And when we talk about minority groups in Brazil, we're talking about public schools, because the middle class in Brazil doesn't study in public schools. They study in private schools. So we have the vulnerable population going to public schools in its great majority. So a policy to acknowledge teachers would be crucial. Obviously, we need to reform our common core curriculum. We have to bring diversity, religious tolerance into our curriculum. Our curriculum is still very elitist, very erudite. And this can help us understand the problem of violence in schools. But to keep to my time, I would say that one of the things we would need would be a policy to train and qualify our teachers and improve their careers. That would be a way of including the minorities and these vulnerable populations.
Thank you so much, Wagner, for your inputs. I mean, we've heard a lot of interventions, a lot of questions from our colleagues who are joining us here today in this meeting. I have gathered a few, and in this short time, I try to classify them. I'm going to mention them, and what I would like to hear from you, just try to give us your thoughts about the topic that is most interesting for you and that you would like to delve into, even if you have any observations or remarks to give us in terms of the interventions. There are a lot of questions related to the document, to the learning recovery programs, the diverse formats, tools, and instruments. There are other questions related to the pedagogical models. What are the pedagogical models that support the interventions related to the recovery, the education of human resources? What are the institutional arrangements of the different governments, the different agencies intervening in this topic, the infrastructure, technology? There are several questions related to this topic mentioned by Beatriz and mentioned by Wagner at the end of his intervention, which is the socio-emotional dimension. This situation experienced by many kids in a lagging situation in terms of violence learning. Violence is not only family violence, but also the violence in the context. These are different type of difficulties that they have experienced during the pandemic, not having a place to. At the time, while schools were closed, there was no possibility to track the courses. So there are many questions related to violence and the social-emotional aspect. There are other questions, as indicated by the three of you, especially Beatriz and Wagner, which have to do with the teachers' education, how to train teachers, how to think about the professional development of teachers in relation to these topics, which strongly affect the society as a whole. There are colleagues that also speak about the trust of education authorities, and we go back to the Pygmalion effect. Only teachers convinced that their teachers can learn will achieve good learning, and only educational authorities convinced that the students can learn, that can also foster adequate public policy. So this is something that comes up. We also see what Mariana mentioned in terms of indigenous communities, the interventions that have to do with the different barriers in terms of language, the different languages that we have in our region. And something worth mentioning, the pandemic has affected a lot the most vulnerable sectors, but they have also, but it has also given us the possibility to think about rethinking the education system, to rethink schools. We need to assume the day after, which is something that we're living in Uruguay, which is we already got rid of the face masks, but the day after also means not going back to the pre-pandemic. We need to think of different schools with other different opportunities for boys and girls and for the youth. So with this overview, with this panorama that is so general, but which was provided by the intervening parties, which has been suggested by them, what will be your thoughts about this? Who would like to speak first? We have 10 or 15 minutes before the closing, so we have some time for sharing this type of thoughts.
Okay. Considering everything we've discussed today, I'd like to emphasize the consequences of the pandemic for education. We still have to map them. In Brazil, we have an ongoing research to know what were the learning gaps that we had during the pandemic. I believe that we still lack this social emotional dimension. Beatrice mentioned it before. We have to take care of the psychological aspect of our students. This is still considered secondary based on what we have seen through the research, but there's an ongoing research with the Harvard University to try to map what were the main policies adopted by the Brazilian states in order to deal with remote learning and with the closure of schools. I hope very soon to bring more news about this. But I'd like to highlight an issue here in Brazil. The Ministry of Education in Brazil, I don't know if you're familiar with this, if you saw this, Brazil is going through a very turbulent time in its politics, and the Ministry of Education didn't have a relevant role during the pandemic. The state and municipal networks, the municipalities and the states were the ones who led the process autonomously, independently, without any type of guidance or support from the central government. So each of the states and municipalities followed their own paths. They even shared some initiatives. We do have some states that have this history of sharing programs, but in general, each state and municipality developed its own policies to deal with the pandemic. Most of these proposals were related to creating the infrastructure so that remote learning could happen, distribution of tablets, of computers, internet access. Brazil, we didn't even have that. We had to try to organize a minimum infrastructure so that education could reach the students. But I'd like to highlight the role of the states. We had very different solutions from state to state. depending on the financial conditions of each state, the type of network they had in place. Just to give you an example, in the Amazon region, the Amazonas state is very large, but it only has 60 municipalities, and they're separated by rivers, by waterways. We don't have roads. So taking printed material to these municipalities was very hard. So an internet solution had to be brought to locations that didn't have that infrastructure. So this is an example that I'm bringing you, and it's completely different from São Paulo. São Paulo is the most industrialized state in Brazil. It's more urbanized, and it used different solutions. So this kaleidoscope that is Brazil, we will still see what worked and what didn't work in Brazil. I hope to be able to share this with you very soon. But I wanted to highlight that aside from the pandemic, we had a very large problem with politics in Brazil. So the solutions were localized. And once again, Denise, thank you very much for your generosity in leading this event. I'd like to congratulate Beatrice and Mariana. It was a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, Wagner. It's been a pleasure for us as well, and I hope that this is the beginning of an interaction and communication in terms of the topics that we have. Beatrice, I wanted to respond to a question that is not so much a question, but this is an affirmation. It comes from Patricia Reggi, and she says that how do you think that we can do to make sure that schools and teachers can add value to the different types of learning, the skills, the proficiency related to the curriculum, but which were developed in this time out. And I think that there's a huge task to do that among different countries, and I would also refer to the school communities, and this is connected a little bit to the social emotional aspects, because in my opinion, being able to take or to determine what is it that our kids learned during the pandemic, what were the different difficulties, what were the achievements, what was the best learning that you achieved compared to something that you could learn at a classroom with a teacher writing on a board. We don't have a response. I think that we could leave the meeting thinking that there may be an awesome model that could be applied in Latin America. I think that the task here is to gather experiences, promote collaboration. Somebody asked about the indigenous community. We need to talk about collaboration among teachers who are indigenous or non-indigenous, as well as students, in order to produce or to establish contacts and new ideas. Great, thank you so much, Beatriz. Mariana.
Pues a mí me gustaría referirme también a la
I would like to refer to the question about the social-emotional development. The priority for everyone is the well-being of students. And then after that, the second thing will be the development of more academic aspects. And in this regard, we need to recognize that schools are a safe space for students in order for them to coexist and to expand their horizons beyond their families. And in terms of what you mentioned, the before and after the pandemic, we need to be aware that going back to school, the new normality, as normally we mentioned that in Mexico, it does not imply going to the same parameters that we had back before the pandemic. We're not the same. We saw that some of the limits were torn apart, and I think that these limitations that at some point in time left us out of our comfort zone allowed us to have more interactions that were not viable in the past. we noticed that there was a lower hierarchies. In the past, we needed to resort to the state education's authorities. This is one option, but it is not the only option. We can have more contact with the parents and with different school staff. We need to reinforce our connections and the forms of interaction that we discussed during the confinement. Thank you so much, Mariana. Well, on my part, I will be wrapping up this panel. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to Beatrice, Wagner, and Mariana for being so kind to share with us their thoughts, their ideas, and also my gratitude to Esther. It's been a pleasure to work with Esther. This document, which will be a different document after the interventions that you have done, and after reading and after reading all the comments, for sure we could move on and we could progress in a more detailed document. But I hope that the document that you have available today can serve as the basis in order to disseminate among the different countries the need to think and to rethink another school. So thank you to the Dialogue and to the World Bank for giving us the opportunity to work in this aspect. And I'll pass the floor to Ariel for his closing remarks.
Denise, y muchas gracias.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you to our three panelists. In these meetings, we learn as usual. And in such a limited time, we learn a lot of experiences. It is very clear that we have a huge challenge at hand, and that we also have a challenge in terms of the evidence available and the decision-making processes. So I think that these exchanges are accomplishing a very important role. We are at the beginning, I said that this is one event of a series of events. Please download the document and make sure you use it. Let's see this as an input for debate and not as the final word to say. Be attentive, because we will be inviting you to other meetings of this series. So be attentive and check your emails, because there's more to come. Emanuela? Thank you, Ariel. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes. Well, on my part, I just want to express my gratitude to everyone for being here today. I do think that it's been a very enriching discussion, and I want to express my gratitude to the authors of the report and also to the panelists. I mean, we heard a lot of aspects in the diversity of the different programs and the factors that we need to look into for purposes of scalability and the preparation by the different sectors and the social-emotional aspect and how it has to be integrated. And then at the end, we need to make sure how can we make sure that we cannot go backwards. We need to use these lessons learned and in terms of designing and implementing remedial programs that could be more effective in order to improve things. You may think that in the future towards a more effective pedagogy or more equitable pedagogy. So we do have a lot of things in our agenda. I do hope that this report can actually be very useful, as indicated by this has to be a living instrument, and the exchange has to continue, because we are all looking at facing the same challenges. And so I think it is very enriching. We need to keep on sharing. We need to keep on exchanging and to share evidence in terms of what works better and what will be the aspects to be considered. So on my part, I want to express my gratitude to all of you. And as Ariel mentioned, we will have other opportunities to keep on exchanging. Okay, greetings, everyone. and we'll move on.